right, let's get started, everyone. Welcome to the American Cetacean Society San Francisco Bay Chapter's April 2024 speaker event. And I'm Susan Hott, board member responsible for our speaker program. And with me is fellow board member Wade Cobb. For anyone new to the American Cetacean Society, we are a chapter within a national organization that is the oldest nonprofit dedicated to the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, and their habitat. And we do this through education, community engagement, and awarding grants towards cetacean research. And we really appreciate your donations in support of our mission. They fund our research grants to scientists and our expenses for these talks. It's easy to donate on our website if you haven't at time of registration. So thank you so much. So let's see. We are recording this session, and please put questions in the Q&A. That is actually better than the chat. And after the presentation, we'll do our best to get to all of them. So our focus tonight is on an iconic ocean neighbor, elephant seals. We're so lucky in the San Francisco Bay Area to be close to their breeding grounds, to see them relatively up close within their colonies. Birthing season is a high point for marine mammal lovers. And tonight we're being treated to our speaker's experience of observation, discovery, and expertise as she shares elephant seal tales from 40 years of monitoring at Point Reyes. So I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Allen, and a little bit about her. She recently retired after 26 years with the National Park Service in various positions within the Pacific West region. During her 15 years at Point Reyes National Seashore, she initiated the Long-term Pinniped Monitoring Program. She concluded her time with National Park Service as science program lead for the regional office, which included identifying and leveraging science needs for parks across the Pacific Ocean from Washington to California to American Samoa. Throughout her career, Sarah volunteered and worked at conservation organizations, including 15 years at Point Reyes Bird Observatory, now known as Point Blue Conservation Science. She has authored and co-authored numerous publications, including Marine Mammals of the Pacific Coast, Baja, California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, published by UC Press. Sarah received her master's in science and earned her PhD from UC Berkeley in Wildland Resource Science. So Sarah, thank you so much for giving us some of your time and most of all, unique knowledge this evening.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Susan, and I appreciate being able to talk about the elephant seals at Point Reyes, which this picture shows here. And after 40 years, I've got a number of tales to tell. So let me begin. So, the first thing I want to step back and just talk about these pioneers in marine mammal research, and they were the ones that were my mentors, either directly or indirectly. Each of them, especially Starker Leopold at Berkeley, was my teacher when he was first a marine mammal commissioner. He was on the first Marine Mammal Commission, and he really focused on ecosystem-based management, on conservation and applied sciences, and on marine mammals throughout California at the time. He spent a lot of time with his students working at the Channel Islands. And then Victor Sheffer I communicated with, and he gave me some wise advice. But then, of course, Bernie LeBoeuf was a pioneer in marine mammals, especially elephant seals. So we collaborated and exchanged ideas. And then, of course, all his students have been an amazing source of the science around elephant seals. So I just want to give a a shout out to thank these pioneers in an amazing species. And what I provide you today is just one little colony compared to all of the colonies that exist, but over its entire journey. So this is the outline of what I'll talk about, just the basic natural history of elephant seals, the recovery at Point Reyes, and then current studies and conservation issues at Point Reyes. So to step back, pinnipeds are not a cetacean, so I'm sure you all know that, but they have to come on land to give birth. That's what has them all as pinnipeds, but their life is primarily in the marine system. So just that background, and this is on a Nuevo, there are not a lot of places where pinnipeds can congregate on shore, but when they do, it makes it easy to study them. And northern elephant seals are part of the Phocidae family, along with harbor seals in California. And what distinguishes the Phocidae family is they have no external ear flap, they have no articulated hips, so they move kind of inchworm fashion across the shore, and that limits where they can come on shore compared to sea lions. And they have short front flippers, so their rear flippers are what propel them through the water. And with elephant seals, there's extreme sexual dimorphism. The males are much, much larger than the females. As you can see here, males are 5,000 pounds up to that, and females generally around 1,000 pounds. So you see this huge size difference. And then, of course, a weaned pup is a fraction of the other two. Well, the males have this strong sexual dimorphism, the large nose for trumpeting, the large teeth for fighting, and this chest shield, which is a secondary sexual characteristic that enables them to have a buffer to those teeth when they're fighting. Size matters, but also if an animal can extend itself higher, males can force a smaller, less agile animal back. But this sexual dimorphism is important and in their history and how they use Point Reyes. And I'll go more into that here. Males are sexually mature at 3 to 5 years, not a full bull really until 8 and 9 years. So this is an example of a full bull, but there's a younger male, maybe 6 years old. And there's, again, a full bull with a full chest shield and the large nose. Whereas the female is sexually mature 2 to 5. The youngest female I ever saw with a pup was at 2 years old, and she had a tag, so I was able to know her age. And they give birth almost annually. This is an example of a congregation of pinnipeds in the Channel Islands. And Starker Leopold once said in his classes, this is the closest thing to the Serengeti, because as far as the eye can see are pinnipeds. And there are the largest concentration of elephant seals occur there. Something like 40,000 pups are born on the Channel Islands. This shows their range, where they occur in the Pacific, ranging across towards Russia and up to Alaska and down to Baja. And this is their breeding range and the current sites where they occur on shore, from Baja, California, north to British Columbia and Race Rocks, and I think in the minor islands in Washington State. This is their annual cycle on land. There are 3 times that they congregate on shore, but because of the protracted periods that are involved, you can almost go to an elephant seal colony any month of the year and find some elephant seals. So the breeding season begins in December and extends into March. Then the molting begins in about April and extends into August. And each sex and age class molts at a different time. And then there's a juvenile haul out in the fall. The rest of the time, they're at sea. So a little bit about their breeding season. Usually the males arrive first and establish their position on the beach. Females arrive in December, and then the peak is about January for the number of pups. The peak for breeding is about February, mid-February. And that whole time they're fasting, they're staying on shore. They don't go to sea during this period. So as a consequence, they lose enormous body fat, and up to 20% of their body weight is lost during this time. Then at the females go back to sea, and they have delayed implantation after mating in February. The egg is implanted in the uterine wall after about 3 months. So their gestation is about 9 months, and they give birth around the same time each year. Here's an example of a colony of Point Reyes. It's a hierarchical breeding system, so the dominant males breed with more of the females, but not all of them. They defend their place near females, but not a territory like California sea lions actually defend a territory. And you'll see the males distributed across the edge of the shore where they're waiting for females to come and go and attempt to mate with them. But the alpha males tend to be in the middle of the colony, or if it's an exceptionally large colony, you could have several alpha males. Females give birth to a single pup annually, and the pup weighs about 60 pounds. It's about 3 feet long, and you see this one on the top still has the umbilical cord. They're born with a black pelage, and as they grow, that direct loss of the female's weight goes to the pup, so that at the time that it's weaned at 30 days, and this is a hard weaning, the female leaves it, it's gained up to 300 pounds. So huge difference in size and transfer of weight. Here's a super weaner. They tend to steal milk, so they might go from female to female. And one study showed, actually, I think it's more than one study showed that it's primarily males that are these weaned pups that steal milk. When a pup is weaned, they'll form these little pods on the periphery of the colony. And here's a smaller pod, but I've seen them up to 100 as they're gathered along the edge. And here's the female on the outer edge in the corner, still nursing a pup. And they'll retain that black coat for a little longer, and then they start molting it while they're in these pods. The females mate primarily with the dominant males, but as soon as they leave the colony into the water, there's a gauntlet of males that they have to pass through. And so they may mate multiple times in the water as they're leaving. And then they'll return to molt. So here's during the molt. This is the same beach I showed you with all the breeding animals, more of a regular distribution. They tend to pile on each other too. And you get the highest count in May when there's an overlap of juveniles and females that are present. So you can have as high a count during the molt at Point Reyes as you can have during the height of the breeding season. And the molt is a radical molt, so they have to come on shore, otherwise they lose their core body temperature, and their fur comes off in sheaths, and you can find it on the beaches at Point Reyes, these large chunks of fur. And I don't know if there are organisms in the sand that eat the fur, but I wouldn't be surprised. It'd be an interesting study, and perhaps it's already been conducted. But it is large chunks of fur that are left on the beach. Now, I don't study them after they leave the colony, and there have been tremendous studies by many researchers, both at UC and Sonoma and elsewhere, looking at their incredible behaviors at sea, traveling long distances, diving deep, diving long, and spending most of their life actually at sea, underwater, which is most remarkable. So if you want to learn more about that, I recommend you ask one of the researchers, like Patrick Robinson or some others, to come and talk about this incredible dive behavior if you have not. what they eat at sea was early on based on looking at stomach contents, and it ranged from rockfish to squid and ratfish, hake, dogfish, but it's limited to understand what they're eating from stomach contents. A couple years ago, one of the interns at Point Reyes documented uh, a seal, an immature, was I believe, a yearling that came in with a spotted ratfish in its mouth. And so she published a little note on that. But it was remarkable. She talked to a couple of researchers, I think Dan Crocker, who's her major professor right now, and not been documented before. So that's why she published the note. But it was a ratfish, which is a deep water fish. She said it was acting like it was showing off with this fish in its mouth. But that was an interesting observation, incidental, brought on shore. Most of the research for underwater studies looking at food more recently was done by Adachi, really interesting paper, which I recommend you look at, documenting they had an animal-borne video on the seal so they could document what it was eating, and it was primarily lanternfish, which is a deep sea fish. These were females. They affixed the cameras to, and plus dive recorders, and amazing study. But that is how we learn about what they're actually eating, not from stomach contents. They in turn are eaten by various predators, and these are predators on all pinnipeds. And grizzly bears no longer occur at Point Reyes, but certainly they would be a predator if they were here. And orcas are a potential predator, and they have been documented to feed on them, I think, down in Monterey Bay. So, and what I see though at Point Reyes are primarily shark bites. So now I shift to the recovery at Point Reyes and more detail about this one colony. So there's a long history about the demise of the elephant seals, but I wanted you to take away primarily that they were documented at Point Reyes. This is what was interesting about Scammond's book that I was surprised to find, is that he actually documented collecting them at Point Reyes. There's no other evidence of their ever being there. The middens that have been looked at have not revealed whether the marine mammal bones were in the middens, as has been documented in Washington State. So that's our only data point to show that they were historically present at Point Reyes. But they were rapidly hunted, and they went through two genetic bottlenecks, one by the whalers, sealers, and then also by the scientists who collected them on Guadalupe Island, thinking that was the last of the population. Fortunately, those juveniles aren't present on the haulouts during the breeding season. I've been at Cal Academy of Sciences and actually seen the bones of a pup that was collected by Townsend. So we're lucky that we still have them here. And that recovery has been remarkable. There are a few marine mammal species that have really rebounded exceptionally since the Marine Mammal Protection Act. California sea lions is one, from something like 3,000 to 300,000, and elephant seals are another, from, well, the actual numbers are estimated, ranging from 100 to maybe 500 seals that existed, and then rebounding to over 200,000 now is the estimate that Lowry et al. Calculated back in his publication in 2014. So this showed from that paper that range, and the main thing I want to point out to you here is most of the population of recovery is on the Channel Islands. But in Central California, which is shown in the graph on the right, you can see that Piedras Blancas is an incredibly growing population. It's growing at a higher rate. I think it's the highest rate of any of the colonies right now is Piedras Blancas. Whereas where the red arrow is pointed, that's Point Reyes, just a slow, constant growth. and the Farallones collapsed. Their habitat changed, and there are less than 100 elephant seals now that breed on the Farallon Islands. Back to Point Reyes, they were recolonized in 1981. I was watching harbor seals and studying them at Point Reyes Headlands, and this yellow star shows where I was observing harbor seal colony, and elephant seals started showing up there. They were first coming in that juvenile haul out that has been documented to precede the colony establishment. And then the colony itself, the first pup was born in 1981 at that site, and that's where the colony expanded. And it grew and expanded all along both sides of the peninsula, kind of like bacteria on a petri dish. They didn't move from Chimney Rock here all the way over to, say, Drake's Estero Mouth. Instead, they moved along the edges, spreading as they were shifted by storms and waves. And now they have expanded all along Drake's Beach to here and now to Drake's Estero Mouth. But it was not a direct movement from Chimney Rock. It was this, and I propose that it's probably predators that are restricting that close affinity to staying to shore. And when I've talked to Dan Crocker and others, they're just hugging the shoreline to avoid those predators such as white sharks, which are known to be in Drake's Bay. So we developed, we meaning when I worked at Point Reyes Bird Observatory and for the Park Service, developed a monitoring protocol, and we wanted to document their recovery. That's what the National Marine Fisheries Service wanted to have documented, and they wanted to have, the Park Service also wanted to know where they were occurring and where they might expand at the park. And we also generally were interested in them as an indicator of changes in the marine ecosystem. But most importantly, and later while I was working with the Park Service, it was to guide management decisions, because the animals had expanded so much that the park's operations were impacted. And we stuck to very basic monitoring methods because this was the long term. We didn't have a lot of money. We weren't going to do the amazing studies that were done out of Santa Cruz with dive and offshore deep sea work. We were looking at those just basic numbers and trends so that we could fold those data up with the other colonies for population assessment with NOAA. And so we wanted to measure numbers and trends, where the colony was expanded. We also looked at environmental factors such as weather and climate and habitat. And then we looked at health. We worked closely with the Marine Mammals Center. I'll talk about that briefly. Our methods were also very simple. This is not high tech. We based it a lot on trained volunteers and interns, and we collaborated with other researchers, and we were a training ground for people who went on to get their master's degrees or doctorates. Right now, there's a student from UC Berkeley who is looking at their reaction to changes of temperature on the shoreline, for example. So we did observation. We tagged every year a small, something like 300 to 500 weaned pups. So we knew the age and the location of where those weaned pups were tagged. And then we dye marked individuals so we could track them through the breeding season. And we got tag returns, which was fun. We got them from all over the North Pacific, and mostly from the San Juan Islands. And this is from yearlings, but also older animals. But you see the wide spread of tag returns that we got. And Medney Island was a surprise. That's an outlier. And that animal was a male. And you see how it is at the end of the Kenai Peninsula and that chain ending up at Medney. You can just see how that male may have just followed that fracture across the North Pacific. he showed up actually 3 years in a row. And he hung out with California stellar sea lions and fur seals. So that was an interesting, not a note, but an observation. And then we documented exchange between females between the Central California colonies. So Ramona Zeno worked with Rick Condit to produce this paper that was on dispersal of these tagged animals that we had in a cohort of 1998 through 2000. And you can see most of the movement is from Piedras Blancas, both to Ana Nuevo and Point Reyes, a little bit to the Farallones. Some movement from Point Reyes down to Piedras Blancas, more to Ana Nuevo, but you can see that there's quite a bit of exchange. And early on, most of the animals that I saw that had tags came from Ana Nuevo, but now more recently, in the past few years, they've been coming from Piedras Blancas. We even had one documented from Baja, California. It came as an immature and it returned and gave birth over several seasons. So there's a lot of representation amongst the colonies showing up at Point Reyes. And it's a peninsula sticking out in the Pacific. You can see how they would bump into it and might gravitate to return to it. So the population expanded both spatially and in numbers. Oh, and this just shows the change for one season and the mean for 3 seasons just in this past year, with the arrival in December, peaking around the end of January, and then dropping off into March. And this represents 3 different subsites. And the main part of the colony is now at Drake's Beach, and a little bit at Point Reyes Headlands, and a very little bit at South Beach. And I'll go into this in a little more detail, but just to show that it was higher than average this year at Drake's Beach, lower than average for the past 3 years for Point Reyes Headlands, and about the same for South Beach, just to orient you on that. And here it is over time from the first, and the growth, it was on average about 8% over the past 20 years. And here, this last year, 2024, around 1,300 pups. Now that's nothing compared to Ana Nuevo or Piedras Blancas, or certainly not the Channel Islands, but it's consistently growing over time at Point Reyes. But not every year is a good year, and those who study elephant seals have noted that particularly El Nino years are when you see higher mortality. 1995 was actually a very wet year at Point Reyes with big storm waves, and we saw a higher mortality during that year. But most years, the mortality rate of pups is fairly moderate, ranging from very little up and on average around 20% per year, now that it's been a fairly well-established colony. During an El Nino year, you not only get the big storm waves, but you have elevated sea level water because it's warmer, and it just washes out the beaches that are on the cliff-facing subcolony. So you'll see this big mixing up of seals while they're in these colonies after they've given birth. And in 1998 in particular, we saw an enormous amount of sand removed. We measured 20 feet of sand both at South Beach and at Point Reyes Headlands proper. An amazing removal of sand in one year. This is not, the picture on the right is not elephant seal habitat. And what was interesting about 1998, we had a graduate student doing her master's thesis, and she was horrified because this was her master's thesis, and she thought she'd failed because the storm had such a huge impact on the colony. But in fact, she was able to closely document the effects of this movement of animals from the main colony when the storm hit to these sub-colonies. And that's how the colonies expanded during these big storm years. They move. When pregnant females come in, there's not much of a beach, they move. So the timing of when those storms occur, if they're early in the season, a female's pregnant, she can move to another site that's more protected. If it's in January at the peak with the pups, then there's higher mortality. And that's what we see in how these subsites grow. The center site is Point Reyes headland, where the colony first formed as a pocket beach. And you can see that it grew at a great rate, and then it kind of vacillated back and forth, and then really has collapsed in the past few years in particular. And that's where that washout can occur. Whereas Drake's Beach, which has low wave action, has a long stretch of beach, and you have very good space for them to expand in, and that's taking off. And then South Beach has large waves. This last winter, they were documented at over 30 feet. So it's not a very good beach to land on or to stay on, though there's a lot of sand. The size of the wave, I think, may have some factor on influencing their use of that beach. As I said, we also monitor baseline health. We look at disease, shark bites, and then also stranded animals. And we've been collaborating with the Marine Mammal Center for a number of years. This Frances Gullen, who's now a Marine Mammal Commissioner, and she was sampling, looking at salmonella in 2000. I think that sampling was taken. It was published in Stoddard et al. And then more recently, we followed up and added microbiome to the sampling, and so that'll be coming out in the more recently. We're looking at this because the elephant seals are occurring in places where dairy cows have runoff, and we were interested to see what might be affecting the weaned pups at that site related to that. So that's the recovery at Point Reyes, and now I'm going into current studies and conservation. And I want to emphasize that what our approach here is adaptive management. We have to be nimble to changes and things that are unexpected, working with the National Park Service management to respond. And if you have a government shutdown, as occurred in 2019, there's no response. The government was shut down. We were all forced to not go to work, stay at home. The elephant seals loved that, and they expanded. So there was no intervention, no documentation of that happening. It's an odd part of our government when that happened. But we do promote collaborative research, so we have others that are able to fill in where we can't. And we also spend a lot of time training that next generation with interns over time. But I want to emphasize this seals moving in public spaces, because that's where management has been forced to respond. And these public spaces are parking lots. They're large parking lots. They're near visitor centers, and they're very public beaches that are popular year round. And so we're concerned about visitor safety and also seal safety, because not everybody is very smart around elephant seals. The bottom right picture is a person taking a selfie with a bull elephant seal. So that was an interesting documentation. This picture we actually got from social media. Somebody took a picture of him being a fool. As the colony expands, we created new protection zones. In the bottom right, you can see these cones where we isolate the seal from the public walking along the beach. Or we have elephant seal free zones where we actually move male elephant seals. And we did get permission for a brief time to move pregnant cows away from the visitor center. But when you have a government shutdown, you can't do that. And so the elephant seals took over the visitor center. We were able to take that opportunity, though, and this is where the being nimble comes in, to we removed part of the parking lot. It's a complicated story, but we took advantage of the seals being there and having some funds to remove part of the parking lot. So we're connecting the wetland upslope with the beach. So it became actually added habitat that the elephant seals could use. So that was a win on both sides. And I must say, the public loves going here. Now, people love going to Ana Nuevo, and they're learning that Point Reyes is another place where they can get incredibly close to elephant seals and watch their behaviors. We have a lot of unknowns that we're trying to understand and prepare for, the pathogens that might pop up, the N1, the avian influenza that's popping up. It was documented with elephant seals in the southern hemisphere. Storm events that are getting larger with these larger waves. We have new potential predators. Black bears are showing up at Point Reyes. I know that they scavenge on elephant seals. I don't know that they prey on them. And then orcas are showing up and documented more regularly at Point Reyes headlands. All three of the ecotypes have been documented at Point Reyes. And I know that they have been documented feeding on elephant seals down at San Simeon, I believe. So these seals are also seeing other predators. In this left-hand corner. We have coyotes showing up at Point Reyes, and they've been around for about 20 years, but they really started showing up around the colonies about 10 years ago. And then a few years ago, we found elephant seal weaned pups on South Beach that had their rear flippers gnawed off. And so we set up a camera and documented that it indeed were coyotes that were trying to prey on the elephant seal weaned pups, but unsuccessfully. They couldn't kill them, but they incapacitated them. And in one winter, it was something like 30 weaned pups. That wasn't repeated. There's been some evidence in the past 2 years, but not at the level that was documented a few years ago. So they've continued to expand at Point Reyes Beach. These are the biggest growing area. And changes in habitat has caused mortality with increased rain and causing landslides and also wave action undercutting the cliffs. So elephant seals tend to pack up against the base of a cliff, and then when you have a landslide, you end up burying them. And so we've seen that happen several times at Point Reyes headlands. But there's also an opportunity with a habitat change. This was a beach where a large landslide occurred, and it turned into great habitat for elephant seals because it created a sandy beach that they used for several years afterwards. So the seals are adapting to the changing habitat in the vicinity of where they routinely return to breed. We've also seen them do different things that we did not expect, of swimming pups. Now remember, pups normally don't swim, at least they've not been documented swimming. Being in the water on the edge, yes, but actually swimming was unusual. So we collaborated and had some graduate student looking at this more closely with Dan Crocker, Sarah Cotty, who's now working at Point Reyes. And she documented that with thermal camera that seals would both behaviorally respond to a high temperature on the beaches, and the temperatures were in the 80s, high 80s. So these animals were getting really hot. And the red seal in the imagery is a hot seal as opposed to cooled down yellow and green as it's moved into the water. And so behaviorally, they would retreat to the water. And then physiologically, they had all these thermal windows where heat was released. And you can see the circular windows across the body and remember, their blubber is highly vascularized, so they can lose heat through these thermal windows. But one of the interesting novel things that we saw just a couple of years ago, and his wife Susan asked me to speak, was about this potential altruistic behavior of a male elephant seal. And we put this out, and we were surprised by the interest very broadly. In fact, the New York Times picked it up. They wrote a much better article than our dry scientific article. But it was fun to see the attention that this got, and we were surprised ourselves when we saw the observation. My co-authors are Matt Lau and Sarah Cotty, and Matt and I were surveying along the beach at Drake's Beach, counting the animals, and we noted a female with a pup on the edge of the water. It was a hot day in January, end of January, surprisingly warm day and no wind. And when we came back on our return, we saw this female in the water that was calling. And we looked, and she was calling to a pup that had been drawn out into the surf. And the pup was going further and further away. We think it was the same female that we had seen earlier on the edge of in the wet sand, because the tide was starting to come in now, and they would have been exposed. Most of that little colony, it was less than 40 females, were higher up on the sandy beach. With this female calling, a male was attracted to her, and he was the alpha male. There were no other males around at the time. He was attracted to her, and he came over and he touched his nose to her side, and I thought, well, he's going to try and mate with her because she's vocalizing. But we were stunned to see him turn around, and he absolutely stampeded, directionally focused, going towards that pup. I'd never seen anything like it. I wish I'd taken more photos, but I didn't want a camera to interfere with what I was seeing. And so he charged into the water, and the pup was probably about 120, 150 feet out, and it was drawn past the waves. So he went out there, and he went past the waves, and then he gradually pushed it back to shore, very slowly pushing it in. If the waves drew back, he'd block it, preventing it from being sucked back out. We couldn't see what he was doing with his flippers, but he had been swimming when he was out past the waves. The waves were not big, but for that pup, they were big. They're about a meter tall, and it could float, but it couldn't swim. And we could see its rear flippers were twisting in the air, but not being used for swimming. And then once he got the pup onto solid sand, the female moved out to it, and then she and the pup moved up onto away from the surf. The male remained in the surf, just on the edge. And again, there were no other males around. So this was an interesting observation. We were kind of stunned, but we stood there watching this. And then the female bellowed. This was a bellow that usually females direct towards male. It wasn't a vocalization that they use with their pups. So she bellowed, and the male, within a minute, just seconds later, trumpeted back. And I felt he was perhaps warning other males, I'm back, don't try anything. Or, as one of the reviewers of the paper suggested, maybe he was talking to her, since it was the same minute that this exchange was going on. There's a lot more complicated relationships than we realize with these animals, and taking time to watch them reveals something different. So I thought, this is an interesting observation. I feel it's important that we document it. And so I drilled down in understanding altruism, and I'm not a behaviorist, so I spent a lot of time reading the literature and the various authors. And the best reference I found was one that came out not too long ago by Kay et al., saying that individual behaves altruistically when its actions result in the reduction of its own survival or reproduction to benefit the fitness and survival of another individual. And there are lots of examples of altruistic behavior in marine mammals, and I give you several examples here. The one I find most interesting and kind of fun. This is the only whale picture in this presentation, by the way. There's a humpback whale that Bob Pittman documented rescuing a seal that was, I think it was a Ross seal, that was on its pectoral fin, and it was protecting it from orcas that wanted to feed on it. And he documents this well, and it's been documented since by multiple researchers of humpback whales uh, protecting and acting altruistically in a number of different species. But mostly, when we speak of altruism with elephant seals, this would be allomaternal care, which is common, and it's also common in pinnipeds. Generally, I've seen it with harbor seals. It's been seen with gray seals and monk seals, where one female might take on numerous other pups or just an abandoned pup. And if she lost her own pup, she might nurse another pup. And LeBoeuf has this documented and early on his research and later. Here's one female had several pups. That's not common, but it does happen. And of course, their own pup doesn't do well if she's nursing a bunch of other pups. Males usually are indifferent to pups. And when they're on the breeding site, sometimes they're aggressive. And that's been documented on Nuevo, and I've seen it at Point Reyes. I have not seen a stampeding, crushing pups, but I've seen them lying on top of them. And I've seen them kill harbor seals. So young males in particular can be exceptionally aggressive. But in the literature, I only found one example of a male California sea lion that was behaving altruistically with a female. And this was the only example of a male acting altruistically in pinnipeds that I could find. And if others have seen it and not documented it, you should write it up, because there's not much in the literature. So again, drilling down in altruism, kin selection is usually the main explanation for altruistic behavior. And LeBoeuf and his students had argued that most of these elephant seals are related because of the bottlenecks they went through. Plus, they tend to go back to the beach where they're born on. And certainly at Point Reyes, most of the animals that we tag and most of the tags we read are of seals that have come back to breed when they've been born there. So they're related. And it's not unusual to have a male be an alpha male at a colony site for more than 1 year. So it's possible that this pup was related to that male, or that male had mated with his female in previous years. Spatial density, though, we felt was playing a role in this, and one of the studies I looked at was by Lloyd et al., and it was recommended by one of the reviewers of the paper, and where for southern elephant seals, they found that in dense colonies, males spent more time being vigilant to competitors and fighting and mating, which you would see at this Point Reyes colony on the right, so packed. And all these are males along the periphery waiting for females to leave. There's no way that a male, an alpha male, is going to go out and rescue a pup. Perhaps another male would, but not the alpha male would rescue a pup, compared to the left, which is a very small little colony with an alpha male with lots of time. He probably is watching the sunset, having a good time on the beach. Well, this caused me to look at how I was viewing male elephant seals on the beaches, because it's common for subadult males and even alpha males, or subadult males and beta males, to hang out on the periphery with the weanling pods. And I have not seen them attack the pups. I've actually just seen them lying around with them. And they regularly attend weanling pods, and this is something that people have seen and documented. And the usual thought was that they were attending to the pods as if they were attending to a harem. So they were treating these wean pups like they were a harem as a practice. But I'm starting to wonder, is this altruistic behavior? And I'm proposing that it perhaps is, and maybe they're defending these pups from other males that might be aggressive towards them. So this is a window of interest that I've gotten our docents and our interns interested in following up on. So we're going to start looking at weanling pods and attendant males and see what their behavior is. Maybe there's more to male behavior than we give them credit for, especially in these sparsely populated areas where they have more time on their hands, so to speak, than others. And I want to end with this emphasis on altruism is a very ancient behavior. And Preston wrote a really interesting article about this, and she was talking about altruism generally and of all different species, but she goes back to this ancient roots in evolution where there's a neural loop where you might have repeated behaviors that could lead to a trait, that could lead to an altruistic behavior. And that K et al. Noted that the processes surrounding the evolution of altruism remains unresolved. So how did it evolve? And it's certainly related, its genetic relatedness is important, and that's a central role. But Preston proposed that non-maternal altruistic behaviors, such as offspring retrieval, which this is, was based in part on the evolution of a neural hormonal feedback loop that reinforced a behavior to solve a problem, something new, a novel situation. Novel behaviors, such as we observe, if repeated over time, might provide insights into how altruistic traits develop or are learned. Though to achieve even a glimmer of understanding of this would require more intensive long-term studies. But it's these outliers where I think the interesting research is. They dive deep. That's an outlier. They're occurring at further places like Medini Island. It's interesting because that is where they are going through these adaptive changes to changes in their environment. And I find that looking for that now is something I want to spend my time in my retired days. So I wanted to thank you for letting me talk to you tonight. But I also want to acknowledge all the volunteers because this work would not exist without our big stable of volunteers. And I especially want to thank colleagues that I have called up all the years, especially Pat Morris, and just to shoot the breeze and understand more about what I'm observing at this little outlier colony. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Of course, I'm thinking we'll have you back as you continue this study. So I think we have lots of questions. Wade, what do you see?
We do, yeah. I will run through them. So I'll try to categorize them a little bit so we're not going too far all over the place. But there's a lot of good stuff here. So I think let's start with some kind of about the biology of the elephant seals. So I guess the first is when you were talking about kind of their fur and skin when they're molting. Is there like a cycle of purpose with that with the fur and skin after they molt? Like, is there any use for it? Do other animals use it? Do you have any information there?
Of why they molt? Is that you're asking? All mammals molt their fur.
No. If anything happens with the fur and skin after they molt, like if there's other animals that use it for anything or anything like that.
No, I think that's an avenue of study if it hasn't been published yet. I have seen some invertebrates on it, sand fleas, for example, but I don't know if they're digesting it. But it breaks up either by wind or wave action. It breaks up pretty quickly, which would indicate to me maybe something is eating it.
Makes sense. And I guess similar on the skin, how sensitive is their skin, and like especially on land, like would being on cement versus a smooth rock or sand hurt them, or are they pretty tough?
That's an interesting question of looking at the different substrates. They really like concrete. It's surprising. We have a boat ramp and they just pile onto that boat ramp. In fact, the Marine Mammal Center has a video camera, a webcam that's on all the time. They documented a birth last year, I think, on this webcam. But they just pile onto that ramp. They really like it. They like the parking lot, especially if it's wet. Perhaps they can lose temperature on a wet pavement. Maybe that's a part of it. They can move fast on it. They move faster on that than they do over a rocky shoreline. So that probably
Interesting. That makes sense. Cool. And so how fast can a bull move? The context is there was a picture where there was somebody who was looking pretty dangerously close taking a selfie, and I think people are curious as far as how close they were to actually being in danger.
Well, they can move once they get up and running, so to speak. They can go faster than I can run on sand. But you do have some warning before they get up. They first wake up, they look at you, and they'll give you a look and start charging you. I don't know of anybody on our beaches that have been knocked down by elephant seals, but I do know that on the Nuevo, I believe there was a researcher that was knocked down and it had charged over 75 feet or something like that. So they can move fast when they want to, and some of these beaches are sloped down, so that even adds to their speed. So they can go faster than I can run. So I watch
Oh,
them
wow.
closely.
That'd be kind of scary if you ended up on the other side of it.
They give you lots of warning. Usually you know when to get out of the way.
Yeah, it's probably best to just not mess with them if they're hanging out there anyway.
The main thing is not to get between two males because they're indifferent to you. You're just in the way.
Makes sense. So there was one photo that you showed where there, and you were talking about it, where the bull was laying on top of the pup. Does that hurt the pup, or does it get asphyxiated or anything when it's laying on top?
We haven't seen mortality from that action by males. If it's on rock, I think that would be much worse. But sandy beach, not so bad. I know that at Ana Nuevo they've documented crushing, but I have not documented, nor our crew documented crushing of pups at Point Reyes.
Makes sense. And then there's all the talk with the avian flu right now. Has there been any detection of avian flu in elephant seals in California?
Not to my knowledge. I know they're concerned about it because of what happened in the southern hemisphere. I believe that it's shown up in birds, but I don't know that it's shown up in dairy cows in Texas and in some other places. So there is concern as birds are migrating through, and it's thought is either shorebirds or water birds migrating through might bring it.
Makes sense.
And
then a couple.
There's a just as an example, there's a whimbrel, no, a long-billed curlew that was banded and at Point Reyes, and it co-occurs right next to where the elephant seals are, and it goes up to Idaho to nest, and it's done this twice. So that could be a pathway as an example.
Makes sense. Yeah, that's a lot of paths. And then a couple on kind of the population and some of the migration pattern, or not migration, but some of the movements that you were talking about. So I guess one is there a specific reason that we know of for the population collapse in the Farallones?
When I talked to the researchers there, it's the habitat changes. So coincidentally, in 1995, there were these large storm events I mentioned, and some of the sandy beach that exists, what sandy beaches were changed, altered completely. So there was access was not possible for the elephant seals, and it became limited to this one area. And now they rest on rock in front of the buildings. That's where they give birth. So it's limited the number and the spatial extent of where they can gather. And I think they probably get pretty hot on those that rocky area in front of the house compared to being on a sandy beach where they can sand flip and cool themselves off.
Makes sense. And then you kind of were just answering it, but do we have a good idea on kind of what drives the kind of year over year variance in breeding grounds? It sounds like sea conditions and storms is one. Is there predators or something else that would kind of make that cause that shift?
Well, El Ninos are a big driver for their productivity. And based on my conversations with some of the researchers, they're also having a hard time finding food. And so they'll skip a year. That may be another factor, but we see fewer animals, they arrive later. And then the storms, the timing of the storms might wash out pups. Now, this was an El Nino year. Was not a big one in particular, but the main colony, which is out on the Pocket Beach, got wiped out. There were several pocket coves that got wiped out. The females had come in and pupped, and so there was mortality there. But Drake's Beach was just fine, and so the direction of the storms has an effect. But it's also an opportunity where seals can arrive, see the conditions, and move to a new site to give birth. So that's how this spreading has occurred. So when the Farallones collapsed in 95 and 98 in particular, that El Nino, that's when Point Reyes got a lot more elephant seals. And we know that they were from Farallones because we could read their tags, and they were tagged from the Farallones.
Got it. And then so on the story that you were sharing, and that the national news picked up on the bull saving the pup. You might have touched on it briefly, but what was the aftermath of that again? Can you talk about like if the pup went straight back to its mother, or what just kind of the general story a few minutes after the salvation?
Well, after the female and the pup moved up on the beach, we didn't have we didn't have tags in the female or the bull, so we couldn't track them as individuals over time. But we had to continue on our survey. So we left after that exchange between the male and the female. So that was the end of our observation. If we had had tags with us, we probably would have tried to tag one of the individuals, though it's pretty hard to tag them when they're wide awake.
Makes sense. And we had one comment from Darlene. She said she's been working with, or she's been down in Año Nuevo for 25 years, and she's observed wean pups playing with overhang plants and other behaviors that just kind of seem like they're having fun and being playful. Is there any documentation about the kind of play they do, and if it benefits anything, or if it's just kind of being pups?
I agree with her. They do seem playful. And I haven't seen any documentation. She should write it up. But I remember seeing one playing with a feather one time, and it was so full. It was a super wiener. Its front flippers couldn't touch the ground, so it was rolling around trying to play with this feather. It was very funny. It went on for a half an hour. That's when I had more time, because you need time to sit and observe these behaviors. But playing is very common with animals. And as I said, I'm not a behaviorist, but I do know that play leads to skill sets later on.
Absolutely. And can you quickly go through what the tagging process looks like? Who does it? Is it NPS or MMC, or and then kind of just physically what are there certain times that you go, or certain behaviors that people are looking for when they're going through the tagging process?
Sure. First, we have to have a permit with the National Marine Fisheries Service. So we have that. And we have that with the Point Reyes, Point Blue is called. It used to be called Point Reyes Bird Observatory. We share a permit with them, and we tag. We have trained people that tag, and who are all on the permit. And so we have trained. I learned when I worked on the Farallones, and then I trained people at Point Reyes, and then their names get put on the permit. And it's called a catalier tag. So it's the same tags that are used in moo cows, put in their ears. And when the weaned pup is asleep or distracted, we sneak up behind them. We lift the flipper, put the tag in between the webbing of the digits. And so that's flesh, that's not bone. And we tag them, and sometimes they sleep through that. But often they'll wake up, but we try not to draw attention to ourselves that we're the source of the tagging, because we don't want them to remember us. And they bite each other quite a bit, so they just look at their neighbor usually after we tag them. So we tag weaned pups so that we know the age and the location and the sex when we can get that, and we put that in a database that we share with the other colonies that also use the same sort of tag and numbering system, but different colors. So Ana Nuevo is green, Piedras Blancas, I think San Simeon is white. We're pink, along with the Farallones of pink, and down in the Channel Islands, it's yellow and red. So we combine our data from Central California, and we've been analyzing it together for a number of papers. Mark Lowry, we've worked with, he's also retired, but he was with National Marine Fisheries Service, and Rick Condit, whom I especially want to thank, because he's taken the time to really dig into our data and combine it and look at this exchange that's been going on. For example, we now know the oldest documented female, 22 years. Well, there was one at Point Reyes, and I believe there was one at Ana Nuevo. The oldest age was 22, which is not very old for a very large mammal. So does that help?
No, that's very helpful, and it kind of leads into one of our last questions here, which was what's kind of average age or average lifespan, and does that vary between males and females? You mentioned some other major discrepancies in biology there. So is there a lifespan difference too?
Yes, and I have a slide I can show. I wanted to make my talk slimmer instead of padded, but I do have a slide on that. Let me see if I can find it and share it with you all. Here it is. This one. There. This again is from Rick Condit, and it shows the oldest female. This was a picture at Point Reyes. And the oldest male, I think, was at Ana Nuevo, 17 years. And you can see that females live much longer and a fairly high survivorship for a long time after that first year. I think it's about 50% mortality the first year. But for males, it falls up much faster. And when you think about it, they're fasting for 3 months. This is the males. So that's a huge loss. They're an alpha male, maybe for 2 seasons, 3, but many may not be breeding, may not be alpha males at all. Doesn't mean they're not breeding, but they may not be alpha males. So it's a hard life for a male. It's a hard life for a female if she's giving birth almost every year too, but they have a longer survivorship. So they're sexually mature for a female, 2 to 5. They tend to, I think it tends to be on the older age that the first time breeding. And alpha male is not a full male is not a full male till he's 8 or 9, full bull. So that's a big chunk of his life already.
Awesome, thank you. And then the last thing, so we have a few folks that want to share some research that they have. We have one person who's a researcher of orcas that published a paper that shows transient predation on a number of prey, including elephant seals, that would like to share some research with you and kind of maybe bounce some ideas off of you and everything. And then some other folks that are looking for your contact info for other questions offline. So is there any way we can point people to get an email address, or if there's another way that you'd like to be contacted?
Yes, Susan can share my email address, and I'll share my cell phone. They can text me too if they want to follow up. I love discussions, and now that I'm retired, I have more time to discuss. And I love the idea of initiating these different studies that I've had in my head. Oh, that should be studied, to actually start doing them. So thank you. Yes, I appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah, so to the folks in the crowd, we'll be sure to share the contact there. Susan, I don't know if you have it, so you can just paste it into the chat. Oh, perfect. There we go. It's in the chat now. Well, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I don't know, Susan, if you have anything else, if you want to wrap up here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one, Sarah, that I just I find myself wanting to know more, and I will have a like all of us, I think, have a new appreciation for elephant seals after hearing from you. So yeah, would love to have you back after you continue your research and study into the altruism. And yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I find there's just such an exciting species. Everything is larger than life, and luckily we can study them very easily on shore.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sarah Allen, and we'll see you next month. Onward.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.